welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to our channel, Simply Human. And this is our last episode on drilling down on imposter syndrome. So how are you doing, Karen?
Oh, I'm doing great. I'm so excited about today's topic about embracing mistakes and growth.
Yeah, we're really hoping you're going to all come with us on this ride as we explore this last part we want to look at in imposter syndrome, and we're calling it embracing mistakes and growth. And why we picked that aspect of imposter syndrome is one, that the traditional or type of imposter syndrome that has a lot of research behind it, again, it typically is talking about people who have are high achievers, but they're in their role believing they're a fraud, that they don't deserve to be there, that they're going to be discovered at any moment. And what Karen and I have also tried to invite people to consider is that imposter syndrome is something that a lot of people experience. To me, it's anybody who in your life you feel like you are in a role, like you're going to be found out at any moment. And that's the whole thing about imposter syndrome is I'm going to be discovered. I'm posing as X, and at any moment, I could be discovered. So there's a little bit of this, when's the other shoe going to drop itis is what I call it. And so why we wanted to talk about the aspects of making mistakes and focusing on growth is because when you have imposter syndrome and there's this fear that if I get discovered that I'm not really the person playing the role, one of the strategies that people end up finding themselves doing is perfectionism. They can't make a mistake. If they make a mistake, they're going to be discovered. And so it creates all of this anxiety and distress or workaholism as you're putting in 120, 150% so that no one ever discovers that you might have made a mistake, or how you deal with failure can be devastating. So we wanted to dive into this and then share again deeper, more transformative practices that you can start bringing into your own life, or as we've encouraged you to, you might want to work with a therapist or a coach, and then you can bring them this information. You can bring it to your session and say, hey, I watched this video and this resonated for me, and I have this terror of making mistakes, and here are some of the practices. Can we talk about that? So that's what we're hoping you could use this information with.
I just want to add one thing that you brought up, and even the imposter syndrome. We talked a little bit about the work. I had imposter syndrome regarding my life, regarding being a mother or being a Christian, and that was part of it. Was feeling like I had to be the best mom, and the pressure that had that I really felt that oh my God, everyone's going to know that I'm not, and then oh shame, 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 not guilt, shame. So I just want to bring that up because it's not all professional, because it even bleeds to your home life as well. So I just want to put that in, and let's just continue to go on with this conversation. But I just wanted to bring that up as you spoke earlier.
Well, here's an interesting thing about what you're talking about in terms of, say, in your day-to-day life, where you may feel when people say, oh, you're such a great mom, it triggers that. But isn't that the wild thing that?
Oh, thank you. But
Yeah,
I
that is
know
actually, it can be compliments. It can be recognition and compliments that makes the imposter syndrome worse,
I
because then it
know.
elevates the expect. Like, oh my God, I've got to keep it up even more. Like, oh God, wait a minute, I just like, can I just bring the cupcakes to the school and they tell me what a great mom, what, whatever it is.
Now I gotta drive 20 miles to the best cupcake maker in the world. And no.
No, but it's sad. Just think about it, though, that we talked about the last couple of episodes about the external validation trap. And look
Powerful.
at what a sticky wicket this is. So, one, there are some strategies for quick alleviation of the suffering, of the anxiety, using external validation, like looking at your performance review or calling a friend, or
Yep.
have them externally remind you. But at
Yep.
the same time, it is exactly that external validation that sometimes can make the imposter syndrome worse. It's just a really sad thing to me, because in some sense, we want to feel that we're being mirrored for the things that we do feel proud about. we want to be recognized. That's a human need, and having that mirrored. So when we talk about the external validation trap, we're really talking about dependency on that validation
Yeah.
versus it just being a positive experience. And then with imposter syndrome, it's just a double-edged sword. You could have that external validation and it makes you feel even more anxious about, oh well, okay, they just didn't catch me this time.
Yeah.
Or you've made yourself dependent on it to constantly need to check it in order to alleviate some anxiety. So that's why we wanted to take some different approaches that have sort of nothing to do with external validation, so that you can orient on an internal sense of confidence and authenticity that you could take in your day-to-day life.
And these are big moves. I mean, when you embrace mistakes and growth, I would say that was a big move for me. Was it an easy move? But it was a big move for me that started to be able to like remove imposter syndrome, or big chunks of imposter syndromes, I should say, with these two words, even because it changes the story about my life. So why don't you go ahead and jump into about mistakes and growth, what and why you actually started with that?
Well, I think what I've seen with my clients is this fear of making mistakes will then lead to being found out.
Mhm.
So,
Exactly.
what we really need to do in that work is start changing the relationship to experience, right? Because mistakes, success, that's all in our lived experience. And then what happens is we start to fear certain types of experiences where it affects our sense of safety. Oh, if I make a mistake, I'm going to be found out. I'm not the smart person, or I'm not the great mother. And then that relationship to our life experience, it loses the joy. So for me, part of doing the work on our attitudes towards mistakes and changing our relationship to it, to understanding that, one, we're always going to have experiences that aren't what we expected. I think that's like to me, a reframe of mistakes. Something that was helpful that my dad told me was, at the time, you make the best choice given the information you have. It's always in 2020 hindsight that you're like, oh, what? I made such a mistake in
That
that.
was a big one for me, though, Christina. When I started not to regret my past mistakes and accept it as I did make the best decision I could make at that time. And would I have made a better decision at that time? It's easy to say yes, looking 2020. But back then, when I really, really thought about it, I don't think I would have made, because our brain is so smart. I don't think it was so. I totally agree with your dad. And when I learned that, that was a huge chunk with my imposter syndrome, too.
Well, what are some of your experiences? Because you said that this has been more of a central piece of work for you, is working on imposter syndrome. So, what's your story around your relationship to the idea of
Mistake.
failure or mistakes?
I think that it's interesting because I don't know if I really thought about things in mistakes. When I think about it, mistakes seem smaller. And I kept thinking anything that I do wrong or that I got corrected on was not a mistake. Okay, maybe a grammar mistake, but even if I made a grammar mistake, I'd be like, holy cow. This is not just one minor mistake. This is huge on my reputation. And I exploded it to actually be like a black mark or like a red F or something. Like I would, that's how I thought, because in imposter syndrome, any little thing I exaggerate it. And so I don't know if I could accept mistakes, because I always thought, oh gosh, they're like a small thing versus the mountain, the molehill versus the mountain or whatever. It was always mountains for me. And that was the problem for me until I could embrace it was a mistake and it's okay that other people do it.
But this is something that I've recently, with the work you're doing now, right? You've called me and said, oh my gosh, I don't think this hit. And, and then it's like, oh, I'm probably going to not get it, right?
Sure. Tell my recent stories. No, just joking. Go ahead. Keep going.
No, but it's everybody makes mistakes. People can make mistakes and have some anxiety or some fear, insecurity, and they don't have imposter syndrome.
Yeah. I
So
go from mistake to shame. I think that
right,
was,
right.
I just go back to
I'm going
I
to
my
be
face.
not to be a
So
fraud. It always has that. So with imposter syndrome, there's always that little piece there. They're going to discover I'm a fraud. I'm going to be found out.
one more niche on the belt that says I'm a fraud. I'm a fraud. It's like when the belt's gonna run out one of these days. So, one more notch on the belt. Ugh.
So for those of you watching, that's what you want to be checking in. Like, does that fear, oh, I'm going to be found out. I'm going to find out be a fraud. And just think about it for a moment. I mean, I want all of you to get in your most compassionate selves. And then think about how you are going through your day with that level of vigilance, that level of worry. It's exhausting. It's exhausting.
It is exhausting.
You know?
Yeah, that's why I come home and I really feel as though, in many ways, I don't have enough time for my daughter and to be really present moment. I felt like I could never be present moment for that reason
The
because I
exhaustion.
always have my guard up.
Mm.
I've always wanted to be present moment for the longest time, and I got it down now. The present moment to be so elusive for me. Now I have it because that imposter syndrome took so much energy. And I was trying to think it through so I wouldn't make a mistake. So I was never fully in the present moment.
What is it that happens that you recognize you're in the middle of it? And then what have you learned to do to start to get out and start to change that relationship to the idea of making mistake or failure, or the things that are triggers for imposter syndrome?
Part of the one of the things I offerings that I have is about internal trigger words and trying to reframe the story related to a internal trigger word.
So can you
And
put in an
so
internal
yeah,
word?
so let me tell you. So for example, was remember I told you earlier, mistakes became like a failure to me. Like a small F failure, not a big F failure, right? But a small F failure was pretty intense for me, and so I had to reframe and spend the time with feeling the yuckiness and then realizing, was that really, like I said earlier, giving myself the freedom to realize it was really a mistake, not a failure. I talked a little bit about this, about the world revolving around me, and I so thought that, oh my gosh, people are going to know, and I'm not the only one, realizing that I'm not the only one that makes mistakes like that, or what I deem was a failure, right? Everybody has these things, no one's perfect. And once I was able to accept what we talked earlier about perfectly imperfect, and then I was able to reframe the failure as not failure as much as a learning experience, which makes me take it into, I was able to make it into a mistake, not a failure. What I've literally done is take the word failure out of my life,
Hmm.
because I couldn't handle the word failure because it was such a strong word for me. It's like receiving that D or F or even C. So this is like the schooling, I think, made me think like that as well. Like it's right or wrong. And if anything right is good, anything wrong is bad. So wrong becomes a failure, wrong becomes an F or a D, and that's not good. And so I think I held it horribly because it would, anytime things would go wrong, I would go home and be so depressed instead of thinking, well, what good happened from it? Did I learn from it? And yes, I learned from it. Like my brain would learn it and never do it again. But instead of it learning and letting it go and putting it into the past, I left the past has such a grip and hold on me. And that's why I had to learn to let go. Because I really believe that you learn from your past, but you got to let go of your past to realize your past doesn't become your future. It's never going to happen. Like you've learned from your past, right? So I knew that in my brain, but not in my heart. I don't know if this makes sense, but it makes a lot of sense because now that I'm exploring a little bit more, I think that's what it came to, is about how I took it inside my heart, because I always knew that I would learn from it. But man, when I did it, it felt horrible. I mean, I really feel like it really felt more like shame than feeling bad or guilty. I really felt shame.
I think that shame is one of the major emotional responses when you have imposter
I
syndrome.
totally agree. Right?
Right. And shame, again, shame is, I'm not okay,
Release.
or
Yeah.
I'm wrong. And think about the word imposter. I'm posing as someone else. So if I get discovered, what they're going to discover is the inadequate. Usually on the other side of the mask is this sort of anxiety and uncertainty. Am I really as smart as my degrees say that I am, or my title in my business that I say I am, or that my spouse says? Is any of that true? Because of a deep-seated sort of a fundamental worry that maybe I'm not really adequate. I work with a lot of men in my practice,
Mhm.
and I would say that's probably the number one issue that I deal with men, is a sensitivity to that feeling of this anxiety of not being enough, being inadequate. It's not called imposter syndrome, but it's the same dynamics where, I see this with men, is they put on their armor, they put on their mask on how they think they should be in the world so that no one sees the scared little boy inside, or the uncertain boy inside who was criticized for not mowing the grass, proper, left a little patch of grass wasn't mowed or something like that.
Or like me, not even straight. That was I went a little bit off. Yeah, I would get.
Yeah, and I love that nowadays, I was just talking to a client about fear of making mistakes. And I said, did you know that they have failure conferences now where,
Oh, I did not know that.
oh,
That's so
yeah,
interesting.
yeah, it's you usually see in the tech world because they've realized that if people have this fear of failure and fear of making mistakes, that they want them to be innovative and take risk. And if you're going to take risk, you're going to have failures. And so if they don't create an environment that embraces it as more innovation, so this the reframe is it's around risk taking, creativity, innovation, and a consequence of that is you might have a lot of projects that fail or things that don't get off the ground, but that's okay. We want you to still be creative and innovative. And so they have these big conferences where people present their fail.
Yeah, I'm not surprised because
Learn from the experience.
yeah, because it was interesting because I was also thinking about something that I did at my old company when I was learning about this one lady who wrote the book Multipliers. But what I loved about, because one of the exercises that they were talking about is to celebrate failure. You literally, as a manager, not like a big wig at the company or anything, but at a manager level or team level, you celebrate the failures and you almost give a award for failures because it's important. And I kept thinking about when you kept telling too about my daughter. I mean, if you think she's she's a PhD candidate, and those people who are in that science, it is about failure because then you learn the next step. And I also learned more and more was, I think this is also what helped me. So sorry to go back to that question that you asked me earlier, but I just triggered something for me about when I learned the fact that all I have to do is the next step, because the next step will lead me, which is the next step. So if it doesn't go well, I'm going to learn from that. Then I have to do the next step. So I was always worried about, okay, being so planned out and know exactly next, right? And then the failure of that. So the point of it is like, if I do the next step and then I do learn from that and do the next step, because each step will open to me a better set of information based on that first step. And I can make a better decision for the next step. So it's almost like for me, I could accept the fact that, okay, I made a mistake and it's okay because that mistake let me learn what to do next instead of calling it a failure. Because the failure would tell me, okay, stop, don't do anything more. You're in the wrong track. Do something brand new because you suck. Well, I hope you X that out. But you know what I'm saying? So it was interesting for me where when I did that, it just says stop. And the other one now, without imposter syndrome, some of the other things, I can go to the next step and the next step and the next step, which I live so much better now with so much less stress because I feel like that has helped me to move on forward and finish things. Because I think I'm not good at always finishing because I was like, oh, that stop there, right? And then I can't finish because I feel like such a failure. And then I'm always behind, like, okay, let me try a new way. And then I start a brand new thing instead of continuing on. And I think that's part of what some of my feedback was, is that I don't finish some things on time. But I think that's because of my mental wiring with this imposter syndrome started to hurt my actual performance. Not all the time, just not all the time. But that was a little nick. And I just never really thought through that until now, actually. Well, when I thought more through that. So,
Yeah, that's really interesting. The difference
yeah,
between recognizing when it's triggering a complete avoidant response.
exactly.
If you keep going in that direction, then they're really going to find out you're a fraud. So just stop, do something else. And then that kind of.
Distract them from that. No.
Well, let me ask you this. Thinking when you're talking is with imposter syndrome, it's an internal fear.
Mm. It's
What
the internal stories that's creating all these fears for me. It's internal stories, internal triggers that are, yeah.
But wouldn't you say that there's a value then in learning how to sort of come clean? How hard is that when you're in the midst of imposter syndrome to say to somebody like, "Oh man, I really blew it here"? Because it seems to me that that would be much harder if you're simultaneously trying to prevent anyone from this fear of being found out as being a fraud. Does that make it harder to acknowledge mistakes when you're
I
in
think
the
it's I think in the end it comes down to, I think it's not as hard. Like, it was easy for me to say that to you because you and I had a certain trust level. So it just depends on, and then I could validate. It's like validating. Did I really blow it or whatever? I would love to be able to say that I could do that with my husband, but my husband needs it. I never understood my work. So that was kind of hard. But but at home I could ask him, do you think I blew it as a mom? Or I could not. So I think you can do it. And then you slowly start to learn it from other people that you trust. And I think the smaller circle, you just need to find that one or two to start to check out your assumptions, your internal stories. And that's what helped me to release those stories and reframe those stories.
wow.
Does that make sense? And then it allowed me to go deeper with my stories because I had someone that I could quote unquote trust to admit this and not feel like they're going to tell somebody else or da da da. But that's where that trust comes along. And it also comes down to that self trust. And I'm now at the point where my imposter syndrome is down, very far down. It still pops up, but that's okay because I know how to deal with it. It's not as, big. It's not that monster like it used to be. I would say now that because it is down, because of my level of self trust, is like we talked earlier about, my self trust has gone up and my imposter syndrome has gone down. It's like those dials, right? We said before my imposter syndrome was high, my self trust was low. But the whole point of it is, it's the whole point now where I think I don't need it so much, that validate, because I can validate the stories myself and then still validate stories with other people, but not as much as I had to, because I'd be validating more stories with my other good friends just to check, to keep myself in check.
So
But it's hard. And, like we said earlier, imposter syndrome is a journey, but it's always giving yourself the compassion that you would give to a friend. And I think that's what we're always talking about, is the inner voice that we said in the last episode about how critical we are of ourselves, more so than we were a friend. And when I started to understand that relationship too, and heard my inner voice, or inner critic, not inner voice, inner critic, I was just appalled. And then I started to realize how I have to change this, because I couldn't survive anymore if I didn't. I got sicker and I had to get well. That's the only way I could get well.
yeah, I think that, we mentioned that shame is one of the primary emotions with imposter syndrome. And what you just talked about, building the capacity to tolerate the discomfort of making mistakes or even failing. Brene Brown, who is a shame researcher, and I'm going to put a link below to one of the resources. It's an audio. It's not a book. It's about 6 hours, actually. The Power of Vulnerability. And
So much worth it though. So worth it. I just put it on your, what's great about it is when I was driving into work, or your long drive, or when you put it on, let's just listen to the
well,
YouTube.
I used to have it. We use CDs more, and I would lend it to clients, and then I couldn't get it back. They'd be like,
Oh,
I've only listened to it 2 times and I want to listen to it a third time. But one of the things she talks about in The Power of Vulnerability is, she calls it the marble jar. She's talking about building trust, how we have to have trust, and how do we know when we trust somebody, and what is that like. But when you're dealing with the shame aspect of it, yeah, it isn't that you're going to just be like, okay, I don't want to be wearing this coat of armor, be an imposter, so I'm just gonna all over the place. That you really want to be discerning and start with people who you trust,
yes.
who are going to give you objective feedback. And then as you build your tolerance and your comfort with being exposed, then it gets easier, and your circle can widen. Or even if it's necessity, say it's in a work environment, and you have, I don't know, maybe just like a mediocre relationship with your boss or supervisor, but you still have to be honest. You've built up a resilience so that if there is feedback that is triggering that fear of being found out, or triggers the imposter syndrome, you'll have developed enough of that ability and practice of tolerance for that discomfort, checking back in, feeling your gut, deciding like, okay, let me going to your reframe, which is going to be more about, I'm someone who embraces learning and growth. Like, so for me, when you're dealing with fear of mistakes, and although I didn't have imposter syndrome, I still had perfectionism. I grew up in a household that was just very critical. I didn't have a very much it wasn't that I didn't have confidence. It was just a huge fear because of the consequences were really frightening, that I could never make a mistake. And so I had a lot of these fears that we're talking about and shame reactions that we're talking about. And learning how to acknowledge and admit to making a mistake, because like you, mistake equaled failure. I had the exact same dynamic.
Interesting.
That was, I'll tell you the crazy place where I started learning how to do it was when I was in school. I went to a very holistic school, so mind, body, and spirit. And body was something, like I said, I sort of identify with how I think. And I was like, I don't know what I feel. So I decided
And
to
I'm the other way. I'm more about feel than
how
think.
you feel. But we were both like our body was a mystery
I
to us.
know. It's like,
Yet it's so important in this work.
we had to learn that. Yeah,
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 so
yeah.
one of the things I did was while I was in school, I also signed up for this course in massage therapy that was a really
Oh,
special.
that was brilliant because massage
Yeah,
therapy is all about the body.
and it wasn't a normal massage therapy. It, it
Uh,
was it was transformational body work, and this instructor collaborates with a lot of therapists for patients who have trauma in their body, and then he works with it at the body level.
oh, interesting.
So one of the things you can learn in massage school is how to receive feedback from the client. It's, oh, can you do it harder? Can you do it softer? Can you move over here? The first time I felt like a complete failure. It just shut, like you said, it was stop. I had exact same thing. It was actually someone I was dating who I was giving a massage, and I didn't have many in my own life. And he got it regularly. So he was like, oh, can you do this? Can you do that? And to me, it was just like criticism, criticism, criticism. And I was able to pull it together enough to say, I'm not a massage therapist, and maybe you could just receive what I have to offer.
Good
But
for you, though.
in my head, I was like, I am never freaking doing this ever again. It was that hard stop. I had bought a massage
Wow.
table too, and I'm like, I'm never doing this again. And I'm like, I'm gonna go to massage school. So that perfectionism drove me there, but it was such a great place to learn how to receive feedback as a gift. I was so huge trying to learn how to receive it as
Yeah,
a gift because
yeah,
I'm wanting to provide a positive experience. And so if the client is saying, hey, this would make it more positive, of course, I would want to know that so that I could then meet their need. And
yeah,
that intensive was the beginning for me. So we learn these things, and I guess my point of my story is, when you learn these things, these life all over the place. It's not. It might just be when you're playing with your kid.
yeah,
Massage school for me, learning to have this different relationship with making a mistake and or failure, and having it just really change into opportunities for growth,
yeah.
opportunities for learning, opportunities to just practice humility, which we talked in the last video about cultivating curiosity, humility, and humor are all part of working with imposter syndrome, right?
And also, when you're talking a little bit about what you said earlier about curiosity, I think something that also helped me with that mistake or failure episode was when I was able to ask people questions back to validate it with curiosity instead of it seeing it as failure, but I was asking them more questions about this to understand my mistake. Kind of like with that, what I thought was a failure. Is there some tweak that we could make? So I was asking more about it instead of assuming it was a big F right at the start again. So when I started to open myself up to ask questions too, because when I started to learn about asking questions and validating my stories, it helped me a lot. And I never learned that skill. I don't know why. I started to learn about it. And I've also learned about the assumptions, how we talked earlier about you only see certain things and you start to make assumptions about things just because your brain makes assumptions. So the more things we talked about this earlier about holding things lighter instead of as fact, like every thought I have is not fact. And when I
Mm.
started to understand that, I had to ask questions, opinions, because it's almost like even the body, when I feel something, I still have to check it out because it's how I'm embracing it in this moment. But I got to hold everything that I think very lightly until I can validate it. And I think that's the hard part that I had to realize, that what I see may not be what it is. Because does that make sense? So
Well,
that also helped me with my imposter
to
syndrome.
clarify, I don't
Please
think
do.
what you're saying is that this is dependent on sort of other people
Oh, no, no, no.
validation. This is about practicing curiosity and
Yes.
openness to basically we all have a blind spot, right? We all have a part of ourselves that we can't see. That's where the external information is useful for seeing the part of ourselves that we can't see. And so what you're talking about is more you opened up to being curious and inviting
Yes. Thank
in.
you for correcting that. That's why I love
Well, I
talking to
correct you,
you.
but I want
It's
to
not
clarify.
like, it's not external validation. It's helping me with the story to get more clear on the story and the impact. It isn't saying, you're great, you're great, you're right, but it just allowed me to widen my purview to better understand, I think is where I'm coming from.
Well, something else that comes up in what you're talking about, and able to be able to do that, it's something we mentioned. I think it was in episode 2, which is part of overcoming imposter syndrome, is cultivating existential courage.
Hmm.
Right? So we have to have that courage first in order to even go to someone, say, hey, this didn't work out, which I'm exposing myself. My imposter syndrome is saying, never let anybody see your vulnerability, never
Yes,
anybody
yes,
see it's
yes,
not
yes.
exceptional. And so I have to be able to have the courage to take that risk. I have to have the courage to invite other people, to admit I have a blind spot, to invite some information. All of this takes courage. And if you haven't seen the prior episode, the way that I define courage, like what is courage? How do we get courage? It comes from the word cur, which means heart. So it's to have heart in the face of fear. So it's not the same as fearlessness. Okay, fearlessness is to have no fear. You know what? You don't need courage if you have no fear. You only experience courage in the presence of fear. So to me, because the idea of becoming a courageous person in the world meant I had to embrace my fears. It was the only way I was ever going to get to experience and practice courage, was to say, I'm going to invite my fears, I'm going to face my fears, and then be very intentional and mindful of what I did, and self-acknowledging, like, oh, that was really brave to do that. So I really want to invite the audience. It's such an important life skill, is cultivating existential courage, the courage to be yourself in the world. We may have people in the audience who are dealing with masking and other forms, and it's not always the safest environment. So all these things go together. You start with people that you trust. You build the resilience. You practice courage. You practice curiosity. Part of the way you get resilience is you learn to laugh at yourself. You have that humor. So all of these things, all
Embracing mistakes,
embracing mistakes, reframing
embracing growth.
the story in our head, all of these things, when you bring them together, will help to transcend imposter syndrome and not just sort of deal with the discomfort of the moment.
So I would like to add this other part, if you are willing to and makes sense, is to talk about the about internal trigger words. Talked earlier about failure, and we talked a little bit about roles and expectations. So in my practice, I focus a lot on this, about the internal trigger words and the importance of reframing, because the word, for example, that I always use, or for example, other than failure, would be like feedback. And when I use the word feedback, or even like anytime I hear the word goals, I just freeze. Like I just want to shrug my shoulders and say, oh my God, goals. I can't handle that. I just couldn't handle it because it brought out such an expectation. And then
Mm.
with my imposter syndrome, it made me feel like, oh my gosh, they're definitely, definitely, definitely going to find out that I failed. So I can't achieve a goal. When I was finally able to understand the importance of reframing the word goal, I had to make the word, instead of goals, I had to make it into the word aspiration.
Mm.
Now, some people don't like aspiration because they think aspiration is a very stretch goal. It's like where you want to go. But for me, It was lighting it was holding the word goal much more lightly. And sometimes you have to do that because it was such a big word I couldn't handle it. But the whole point of it is even the goal as a either or like let me give an example of a word, a role. Role's a Christian. I mean, that was so heavy for me. And I didn't change that word. I just had to reframe what a Christian really was. And accepting where I was in this moment in time in my growth as a Christian. And we all have different paths as a Christian and journey in our relationship with the Lord. And when I started to release myself and not put anybody better than me, it's just accept everybody exactly where they were. We're all on our own journeys. And so it made me to like lessen that and reframe that word as a Christian. And then I did other things to reframe my word as a Christian, what it meant, until I feel very good about what being a Christian means. That it's not about it's striving, it's the aspiration. But I know what it means in my mind, what it means to be a Christian. I'm learning more and more as I go to church every Sunday, and God guides me through different experiences and things. But I guess I say that because it's so interesting about even what it meant to be like, okay, so let me just say again. Remember I told you I went to MIT Sloan, right? Sloan, the word Sloan put a lot of pressure on me. That's why never went to reunions other than my first reunion after the 5th year because I was still a consultant. But then after that, when I worked in my other company and I wasn't a consultant anymore, I didn't feel like I should show up because I was so embarrassed. But again, it's so funny because what is a slow meant? And it just put this heaviness towards it until I could redefine what that means. Because only me that I went to MIT. It didn't define who I became. So I think the point for me is important to just understand those internal trigger words or those certain words that are like holding you back and that bring up that, when someone says it, it's a, and that's what happened to me when someone said, oh, you went to MIT Sloan, and then said, you're so smart. And I'd be like, oh, right. And so when you have those, you just have to hold it again lightly. And why am I reacting that way? And learning that it's a story that you're holding because you validate it. It isn't like what you're thinking it is. And that's what I invite you to begin to hold those definitions more lightly about those role expectations or those trigger words and try to deal with it what it is or talk to a coach or a therapist to better understand those words. That's one of the offerings I have that I love because when I can take away some of that, it allows people to just be able to breathe again. They notice this word, it's like someone else was talking about ASAP, and they hate that word. And the reason why they hate that word is because someone would email them and they would be as ASAP. So what triggered for them is they wanted ASAP, and it's like first on their list, but for me, it's 10th. And they don't seem to understand. I told her, like, let that mean as soon as possible for them. Don't make an expectation. Go back to them and say, so let me tell you what the situation is, and just understand I can only do it then. And so this is part of it, right? We're valuing your option to go back to them and talk to them and not taking that as solid, like you have to do it and don't let it trigger you. I guess that's where I'm going. But I
And
hope
that's
this makes sense. So maybe you could take a translation about what I said. Um, with this whole thing about trigger and reframing.
well, I was going to say, that comment you made before about the stop, to be able to notice what causes to stop, because in this example, that stress, that anxiety may have caused that person to freeze. I was just thinking about, like, for me, a trigger word used to be selfish. If
Yes, that'd be a trigger word for me too.
it's interesting because I'm actually a giver nurturer type. So the giver nurturer types, selfish is a taboo word for us. It's like the worst thing you can possibly
You
be.
don't want to be seen as
Be
selfish, right?
selfish. So that's all you had to do is people who are givers and nurturers. I think there are people who figure out that that's a word for us. And if we try to do anything for ourselves, they're like, oh, well, you're being selfish. And it would, that's not, that word would shut me down. And so my therapist did this really great reframe. And she said, well, why don't you think about it as self with a capital S, meaning the authentic self?
Ah,
She knew I had a value around authenticity. Why don't you think about it as self with a capital S hyphen ish? Like greenish or bluish is to be like self. So if I was trying to do something that was actually honoring my own needs, she's like, isn't that trying to be aligned in integrity with self? Self
mhm.
hyphen ish. And that reframe, expanding the way I was thinking of that word completely changed my relationship to it. And it aligned it with my values. And when you were saying goal versus aspiration, like to me, I totally get that because goal is such a terminal thing. It's a goal. It's here it is, goal. It's concrete, transactional.
Black and white in some ways, but really not.
But the word aspiration, which has spirit in it, in the word aspiration, the breath is spirit, it adds heart and feeling to it. It's not just this terminal transactional thing. It makes you connect to your values, it makes you connect to your heart when you think about it. And to me, that's way more motivating for someone like me is what am I aspiring to? So you know me, I'm a word nerd. So
I know.
so I do think that what would be really helpful for people watching this episode is to think about is to write a list of words and look for that stop, because I think that's a great cue. What are the things that stop you in your tracks, halt you, trigger avoidance? Because then you're going to start getting a sense of what these trigger words are. And those are the words to start challenging. Can I reframe this? Is there a different way to think about this? Is there a different word altogether? And that could help in dealing with this reaction, right?
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting because when I started to teach some of my clients this, or it's around the ability to know those and just know too that some of them will be easy for you to do yourself. Because once you get this practice about holding it and holding it lightly, but sometimes it's like that selfish that you're talking about. You need your therapist to help you because some of them are really hard that really need someone else that you can trust, like a therapist or a coach.
Get a word
Yeah,
nerd.
to help you reframe because you just can't think through it. You just can't give another perspective. But if you can't do it, don't worry about it because that just means it has a harder grip, and it make time to loosen up a bit. And then also sometimes you need that therapist and coach to really break it up. But it just depends. Like we're all different. I want to just come back also to the word feedback. When I saw the feedback as a gift and a gift that I did not have to take, someone taught me when I went to my organizational development master's degree. They're saying see the feedback as something as a gift to you because part of it is their perception of what X looks like, which is right for them but may not be right for your personality, and you don't know. So that's why it's great as you see it as a gift to you, and then you get to discern what parts of it make sense. But you have to know that part of it is true and their perception, what they think. And so I think that's what's so great about it is because I do believe when I started to see feedback as a gift instead of the feedback that I used to see it as black and white, like I failed. Then feedback meant change instead of just hold it lightly. I just love, guys, I'm telling you, holding things more lightly, everything that passed through your thoughts helped me so much more in imposter syndrome.
Well, we're getting near the end of the hour.
Yes, we are.
Folks, we try to touch on a number of different aspects of working with imposter syndrome at more of a deep level. Like, none of this is quick fix. All of these are ways we want you to start thinking about it, that there's a path if you want to invest the time that will help you actually transcend the anxieties and fears associated and the insecurities with imposter syndrome. But this isn't comprehensive. There are certainly aspects of imposter syndrome that has real roots in social and cultural biases and prejudices that people are dealing with all the time, or finding those people who you trust or who you can be vulnerable with might be a little challenging right now. We want you to sort of think of this as a springboard, as a starting point. We're going to be having a lot of different topics that we're going to be talking, and many of them will apply to working on imposter syndrome as well as other aspects of just the experience of being human. So we hope that this series has been helpful to you. Karen, thank you so much for sharing your own personal story with everybody. That's just, it made it incredibly rich, and I appreciate so much this partnership with you.
Yeah, well, also you use some examples too. So I think that's what's interesting about us. I love this because, like we said earlier, I swear I learned something new again on this. I think what's cool about it is the fact that we're always learning from her and I are, while you guys are learning as well some of the things as we go through all of this. this journey together. I think that's what it is. Again, in the comments, you can even say what you learned the most from the video. So that'd be great too. All right. Until next time, which I think we're going to talk about self-trust, then possibly boundaries. So we're so excited about you joining us on these different topics.
And don't forget, hit subscribe, hit the like button. And if you are finding value with these videos, please share them with family, friends, anyone that you know who may be struggling with imposter syndrome or any of the other topics we're going to be covering. And yeah, it's amazing. There's so many things that we need to succeed in life. We take all these other things in school that you never use again, but we don't learn simple things like healthy interpersonal boundaries. So we're looking forward to this journey. Again, please put in the comments issues
Any
or
topics
that you would be interested in that is part of this big experience of being a human being. And we will do our best to get to it. And thank you all for joining us.
until next time, guys.
Bye, everybody.